The Russian President Vladimir Putin is calling this a, quote, special military operation to protect Donbass. It is clearly bigger than that. Now, he made a surprise appearance on state television calling for the demilitarization of Ukraine, blaming the government in Kyiv for bloodshed, but said Russian forces are not planning an occupation.
Whoever tries to interfere with us, and even more so to create threats for our country, our people should know that Russia's response will be immediate and will lead you to such consequences that you have never experienced in your history.
Now, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, he went on Facebook again to address the nation. He says he's imposing martial law but urged the country not to panic.
Today, each of you should stay calm. Stay at home if you can. We are working. The Army is working. The whole sector of defense and security is working. No panic. We are strong. We are ready for everything. We will win over everybody because we are Ukraine.
Jim, you are there this morning witnessing generations of post-World War II order upended.
John, that's right. We wake up this morning to a war in Europe, a deadly one already. Take a moment to consider that. And it unfolded, it began to unfold last night in what you might call a worst-case scenario. U.S. intelligence assessments for weeks had been saying that Russia was preparing for a broad-scale invasion of this country, beginning with an air campaign and a missile campaign and an artillery campaign. That's exactly what we saw, quickly followed by ground forces. The first targets hit with cruise and ballistic missiles in Kyiv, the capital, in and around Kyiv, the capital, in Mariupol in the south, and in the northeast of the country in Kharkiv, hit by artillery barrages. And very quickly after that, that effort to, in effect, soften the battlefield as well as strike military targets to attempt to disable the Ukrainian military, came the ground forces across the border, including armor. And it's interesting, you showed those pictures earlier of tanks rolling along the highway from north of the country in Belarus here into Ukraine. We had a lot of talk early on about how the weather would cooperate. Would the ground be frozen enough in the east for those tanks not to get bogged down in the mud? What did we see? In reality, we saw them driving down the highway into this country at top speed. That's how quickly this unfolded. We are hearing of this morning, though, of resistance from the Ukrainian military. There is a fog of war. We have to acknowledge that. It is hard to count casualties at this point, though both sides are claiming them. Both sides are claiming as well to have destroyed targets on the other side. It is hard to corroborate those until you see them yourself. I want to get to how this may extend beyond Ukraine, because we heard just a few moments ago from the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg speaking from NATO headquarters in Brussels. And he said this, and I think, John and Brianna, this puts a point on it, if you want to say. He says that we are waking up to a new normal for our security, speaking of NATO's security, that peace cannot be taken for granted. That is NATO's view. That is the U.S. view. And if you were listening to Putin's words as he launched this attack, also in his address to his nation on Monday, he wasn't just threatening Ukraine, that significant enough, but he seemed to be challenging the post-Cold War order. He seemed to be setting his sights potentially on other Eastern European nations, some of whom are now members of NATO. That's where we stand. Just one other thing I want to mention that the NATO Secretary General spoke about. He reiterated that NATO has no intention of committing its own forces, its own troops, to fight Russia in Ukraine. It remains a military support operation, if you want to call it that, supplying lethal assistance to the Ukrainian military, and he spoke of continuing that, but no NATO troops on the front line. That said, Russian forces and NATO forces are now in very close proximity. More NATO forces have been moved closer to that eastern frontier, close enough that the NATO Secretary General highlighted that deconfliction communication continues. That is, that's deliberate communication between NATO and the Russian side to make sure that their planes in the air, the ships on the seas, their ground forces don't get too close to each other, don't misinterpret moves as attacks or acts of war. That, John and Brianna, just highlights the diciness, if you want to call it that, the danger of how when you have this much going on, the danger of escalation is real.
Jim, I can just give people a sense of what you're talking about there. You're talking about NATO membership. There are new U.S. troops that are rotating in to Latvia up here. That, of course, all the way up here in the Baltic region. Yeah. You can see it's right on the border with Russia. Ukraine is obviously all the way down here. Poland, there's U.S. troops here now. Very close proximity, as you say, to Russian troops. Deconfliction is necessary. And one other thing, Jim, I just want to point out where you are. You're over here in Lviv. There have been reports now of explosions just all over the country. This is a large-scale, multi-targeted attack, including, I should note, we're getting reports not far from you. I know you've had air raid sirens there. What does this tell you? Just the scale of what has happened over the last few hours.
It tells you that Putin wants to take over Ukraine. It's an independent country. It has sovereign borders. It's democratic. It has twice in a row elected presidents who promised closer relations with the West and more independence, not less, from Russia. Putin doesn't like that message. So he's using force to take it over and extending, well, the whole extent of the country. When he says peacekeepers in the East because of Nazis, for which he provides no evidence, that's a cover. He's, in fact, carrying out an invasion of this country and attacking targets across the country that shows that his intention is to own the country, right? And that's the way we should look at this military operation now.
Это пиздец.
Обстоятельства требуют от нас решительных и незамедлительных действий. Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, з которыми ви в своїй історії ще ніколи не сталкивались.
Ми вже видаємо зброю і будемо видавати для захисту нашої землі всім бажаючим, всім спроможним захищати наш суверенітет.
Peace on our continent has been shattered. We now have war in Europe on a scale and of a type we thought belonged to history.
Innumerable missiles and bombs have been raining down on an entirely innocent population. A vast invasion is underway.
We condemn this barbaric attack and the cynical arguments to justify it. It is President Putin who is bringing war back to Europe.
Ukraine, striking military posts across the country. An unprovoked war in Europe is now underway. The assault began with an angry message from President Vladimir Putin broadcast in the middle of the night. Russia cannot feel safe, develop, and exist with a constant threat emanating from the territory of modern Ukraine, he said, describing the government in Kiev as a junta of neo-Nazis determined to build nuclear weapons. As Putin spoke, seemingly on cue, Russian bombs started falling. Cruise and ballistic missiles, Ukrainian officials said, along with attack helicopters striking military installations, including air bases near the capital, Kiev. And more military targets in several other Ukrainian cities, including Kharkiv, the biggest city in eastern Ukraine. Russia claimed to have eliminated much of Ukraine's defenses, but the Russian reports appear exaggerated. Several videos showed what Ukrainian officials described as columns of Russian tanks entering Ukrainian territory. A potentially devastating war in Ukraine has just begun. But so far it appears to be a gradual assault. Putin, who said he does not want to occupy the country, may be trying to take Ukraine without having to fight hard for it, appealing to the military not to resist. But there are no signs Ukrainians are raising the white flag. President Zelensky, in a pre-dawn appeal, told Ukrainians to stay strong and calm as he announced the start of martial law. While some Ukrainians in Kiev were heading out of the capital, many are determined to stay and resist. In Mariupol, people this morning were stocking up on cash with long lines at the ATMs.
How are you feeling?
I'm nervous and I'm trying to keep my children calm, said Yulia.
Putin says he's doing Ukrainians a favor by trying to get rid of their Nazi fascist government. What do you think about that?
We don't need his protection, she said, and dismissed Putin's claims as lies. Supermarkets were flooded too, 45-minute waits for checkout. This is our Ukraine. I'm staying. I'm calm. I'm even smiling, said Ivan. Ukraine has mobilized its forces and begun to defend its cities. The government is calling for urgent blood donations to treat the growing but still unclear number of casualties.
Putin, in his message that launched this military offensive, seemed to have a special message for the United States, reminding the world that Russia is a nuclear power, and said that anyone that tried to stop Russia's actions would face terrible consequences. Hoda.